On the night of the horrific tragedy, police believe the assailant lured the woman to a secluded spot near a beach access point known as Mark's Landing. It was no random location, as the sand dunes would have swallowed up any tracks, and the roar of the ocean would have drowned out even the harshest of screams. Under cover of darkness, the woman was trapped and subjected to a horrific attack. The blows came quickly, sharply, and with a blunt object, leaving the woman lifeless on the sand. However, perhaps the most memorable part of this crime is not just what happened that night, but what happened after. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. In the quiet beach town of Indianantic, Florida, where the sea breeze carries salt along the sun-bleached streets, time seems slow. Neighbors greet each other by name. The rhythm of life is shaped by the tides, fishing boats and seagulls circling overhead. It's a place that, at first glance, seems impervious to the darkness of the big world. A place where people feel safe, where the charm of a small town envelops every corner like a soothing blanket. But even in the most idyllic communities, life holds its secrets, and behind smiling faces, there are often stories of anguish, struggle, and sometimes grief. Kelly Brennan was one of the people the city noticed, not because she demanded attention, but because she radiated something magnetic. Kelly was born and raised in Indianantica, and she had such a presence that she filled a room without even trying. Friends and colleagues described her as bright, funny, and infinitely compassionate. She had a laugh that could make you forget about your problems, and a sympathy that permeated the lives of everyone she touched. She was the kind of nurse that patients were asked for by name, the kind of friends who showed up when you needed her most, and those neighbors who remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and small personal milestones. Professionally, Kelly was a force. She spent years dedicated to healthcare, often working long, grueling shifts at local hospitals. Her colleagues spoke of her tireless energy, calmness under pressure, and her ability to mentor young nurses with a firm but caring hand. She was more than just a work colleague. She was the cornerstone of the hospital team, the person whose opinions mattered, the one people turned to when the pressure was rising. However, Kelly's compassion didn't end when she left. She volunteered at local shelters, shared her experiences with community health initiatives, and worked behind the scenes supporting causes she believed in. Whether it's organizing charity runs or setting up free clinics, Kelly has made it her mission to give back. Friends who knew her well say that behind her optimism was a difficult woman who had gone through her share of disappointments. She faced romantic grief, including a painful divorce, and worked hard to rebuild a life filled with meaning and joy. In her early 40s, Kelly found herself at a crossroads. She was successful professionally, but still yearned for something deeper, something that would fill the spaces left by past grievances. She longed for a true connection, a love that would bring not only friendship, but also peace. It was during this chapter of reinvention that Kelly met Dan Trott, a man well known in Indianantic political and social circles. Dan, the former mayor, was charismatic, intelligent, and outwardly charming. It is important to note that he was also separated from his wife, Sheila Graham Trott. Small towns have long memories and sharp tongues, and Kelly's bond with Dan quickly became a topic of gossip. But Kelly, always an optimist, was determined to follow her heart. She believed in second chances and was fascinated by the idea of building something new with someone who seemed to understand her desire for depth and partnership. Their relationship flourished publicly, but in private life the situation was much more complicated. Sheila, though legally separated from Dan, remained a strong presence in his life, thanks to mutual friends, property connections, and, as some whisper, unresolved emotions. Acquaintances describe Sheila as tense and at times, unpredictable. She was not the kind of woman who quietly faded into the background. For Kelly, that meant building a relationship that was never just between two people. Friends later recalled that Kelly sometimes expressed concern about Sheila. At one moment she laughed at strange encounters, and at another she expressed quiet fears. But Kelly, who had always believed in the best in people, continued to insist. In her personal journals, which she kept late at night when the house was quiet, Kelly wrestled with familiar questions. Had she done the right thing? Can love really overcome the tangle of past wounds? Was she finally on the cusp of the life she had always dreamed of? Or had she fallen into a web she didn't fully understand? These personal reflections reveal a woman who was introspective, thoughtful, and, above all, full of hope. More than anything, she wanted to believe that the future could hold joy. Outside of her romantic life, Kelly found fulfillment in the simple pleasures of her seaside town. She jogged on the beach at dawn, bicycled along winding coastal trails, and took long walks with her golden retriever, Max. She loved tending her garden, found peace in carefully planting herbs and flowers, and found solace in watching the waves, often describing the ocean as a place of her renewal. Her social calendar was full. Coffee dates with friends, social events, and family dinners. To the outside world, she seemed like a woman in the prime of life, accomplished, tied up, and on the verge of something new. But, as close friends later recalled, there were thin cracks in this painting. At times, Kelly seemed absent-minded, as if she was carrying a burden she wasn't ready to share. She brushed off fears with humor, or a wave of her hand, never wanting to impose her problems on others. Yet, behind closed doors, she struggled with the complexities of loving a man whose past wasn't entirely in the past. Psychologists often talk about the tension between hope and denial, especially in people who have experienced heartbreak. Kelly's story reflects this dynamic. A desire to believe in a better future even when warning signs appear. A desire to rewrite her narrative even when old patterns threaten to resurface. Looking back, many who knew Kelly wonder, did she feel threatened? Did she feel the undercurrents of something threatening? Or was she simply caught up in a heady mixture of new love and old wounds? Vulnerable like all people when they open their hearts, Kelly was full of plans. She excitedly talked about upcoming projects at work, about trips she wanted to make, about dreams that she had postponed for too long. She was reuniting with old friends, making plans for the future, and apparently ready to take on the next chapter of her life. But life, as it often happens, had other plans. What happened next shattered the peace in Indianatica, causing a wave of grief and disbelief throughout the city. A woman who gave so much to her patients, friends, family, partner, became the center of a tragic story that no one could have predicted. And then, there was a chorus of voices asking the same heartbreaking question. How could something so horrible happen to someone so beloved? It was night, like so many others in Florida, a quiet coastal town. On one of these seemingly peaceful February nights in 2010, Kelly Brennan, a beloved nurse and energetic member of society, was scheduled to meet with a friend. But when she didn't show up, anxiety began to spread to a small circle of people who knew and loved her. Kelly wasn't the kind of person who just disappears. She was reliable, thoughtful, and attentive. Disappearing without warning was not just unusual, it was unsettling. As the evening drew to a close, the anxiety among Kelly's friends grew stronger. Messages went unanswered, calls went straight to voicemail, and social media messages went unanswered. At first, the friends comforted themselves with practical explanations. Maybe her phone battery was dead. Maybe she was delayed due to an emergency at work. Or maybe she just needed some rest. But as midnight came and went, these explanations lost their power. By early morning, the friends began to be gripped by quiet horror. Everyone felt that something was wrong. Back then, no one could have known that Kelly Brennan's life had already been brutally stolen. That night, she crossed paths with someone she trusted, with whom she might have thought she could make sense, with whom she had no reason to fear. And that meeting was a fateful turning point in her life. The crime in which Kelly Brennan died was not accidental. It was not the work of an unknown intruder lurking in the shadows. It was deeply personal, shaped by confusing emotions, jealousy, resentment, and betrayal. In the days that followed, as law enforcement worked to piece together what had happened, a grim story began to emerge that painted a chilling portrait of how personal rivalries and long-standing grievances could escalate into violence. According to friends and witnesses, Kelly was calm and friendly, dressed as usual. No one saw the strange people nearby or the panic in her eyes. There were no signs of violence. All signs pointed to girl leaving voluntarily, probably to meet someone she knew. But who? As investigators dug into the details, the name kept popping up: Sheila Graham Trott. Sheila wasn't just an acquaintance. She was the ex-wife of Dan Trotta, the man Kelly was dating. While Dan and Sheila were separated, their lives remained intertwined through shared property, mutual friends, and, perhaps most importantly, unresolved emotional strain. Kelly's friends later testified that Sheila's attitude towards her became increasingly hostile over time. There were stories of harsh, bitter remarks made in public, of capricious, unpredictable encounters, and of simmering anger that seemed ready to spill out. Sheila did not immediately call the police. She did not confess and did not report the incident. Instead, she waited. And the next day, she told her sons that she had a vision, a dream in which Kelly was sick and needed to be found in Mark's Landing. Her sons, caught in the confusion and strangeness of the moment, accompanied her to the scene, and there they made a heartbreaking discovery: Kelly's body, partially hidden but unmistakably lifeless. Why did Sheila choose to present herself as a person with a vision? Was this a calculated move to control the narrative? Was it a way to mask guilt, to seem concerned rather than guilty? Or was it part of a deeper psychological disorder, a sign that the mind was struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had been done? Experts on criminal behavior note that some people, faced with the consequences of an extreme act, go to great lengths to cover their tracks, not always out of cold calculation, but sometimes out of denial, shame, or panic. Sheila's actions in the hours following the crime added layers of complexity that investigators will have to carefully unravel. What followed was a tense and emotionally fraught series of events. Sheila's mother, alarmed by her daughter's strange behavior and implausible story, called the police that night, informing them that something terrible had happened and that Sheila might be involved. By the time law enforcement arrived at the beach, the pieces of the puzzle had already begun to take shape. For the people of Indianantic, the news spread like wildfire. A community that had previously considered itself largely immune to violence is now confronted with a horrific truth. One has been captured in a senseless, deeply personal act of brutality. Kelly Brennan, a nurse who cared for countless people, a friend who lifted up others, a woman who dedicated her life to helping those around her, is gone. And the person responsible for this was not a stranger from the outside, but someone from their own community. Emotional shock spilled out, reaching hospital colleagues, neighbors, old school friends, and many people whose lives Kelly touched. Memorial vigils were held, candles were lit, and tributes were showered with a portrait of the woman who meant so much to so many people. However, there was also a growing demand for answers behind the public mourning. Why didn't anyone see this coming? And what will the investigation reveal about the hidden tensions and betrayals that led to this horrific outcome? The investigation that followed revealed layer after layer of betrayal, obsession, and heartbreak. And at the center of it all was a woman who claimed to have found a body. A woman whose alleged vision investigators believe was not a psychic epiphany, but the key to solving a carefully veiled crime. A night that destroyed not only one life, leaving scars that will last for years to come. When the detectives arrived at Mark's Landing that night, they were greeted with a scene that was both tragic and deeply perplexing. Kelly Brennan's lifeless body, lying under the pale moonlight next to the dunes, was a silent witness to the attack that had taken place just hours earlier. But the investigators' attention was immediately drawn not only to the crime scene itself, but also to the strange, almost surreal chain of events that led to the discovery of the body. Standing nearby was Sheila Graham Trott, who told police that she had a vision, a vivid dream, something she said was inexplicable, that led her and her sons to the place. She was accompanied by her 2 teenage sons, who drove her there and, in their own words, had no idea what they were about to see. It was, by any standards, an extraordinary statement, and for experienced investigators, it immediately raised red flags. How could someone know exactly where to look if they weren't in some way connected to the crime? Leading detectives understood that in homicide cases, especially those involving personal relationships, the circle of suspicion often begins near the victim. In this case, Sheila was not the background figure. She was the ex-wife of Dan Trotta, whom Kelly was dating. And now, by claiming to have found Kelly's body, Sheila has put herself at the center of the investigation. As the officers cordoned off the crime scene, took photographs, collected physical evidence, and began to survey the surroundings, one question became more important than all the others. How did Sheila know where to look? The next phase of the investigation focused on a thorough reconstruction of the timeline of Kelly's last hours. Detectives decided to interview every person who saw or spoke to Kelly in the days and hours leading up to her death. Friends, family members, colleagues, neighbors. The result is a portrait of a woman who, in her final days, found herself in the grip of a tense and emotionally charged love triangle. Many friends recalled that Kelly expressed concern about Sheila, describing her as unstable, stressed, and increasingly erratic. There were stories of awkward encounters at local cafes, hot phone calls, threatening messages, and tense fights, all of which painted a picture of rivalries that quietly escalated. Investigators began collecting phone records, reviewing social media communications, examining text message history, and mapping Kelly's movements. Digital footprints can often tell a story that people either can't or don't want to share, and in Kelly's case, they revealed patterns of communication. A flurry of messages between Kelly and friends expressing her growing concern, correspondence between Dan and Sheila that hinted at unresolved tensions, and moments of silence that raised even more questions. As they dug deeper, investigators learned that Sheila's marriage to Dan was falling apart long before Kelly appeared on the scene. Financial stress, emotional distance, and years of accumulated frustration made Sheila feel marginalized, rejected, and resentful. Witnesses told police that Sheila became increasingly obsessed with Dan's new relationship, perceiving it not only as a romantic betrayal, but also as a deep, personal humiliation. For Sheila, Kelly wasn't just the other woman. She was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life, and that dangerous resentment had been building up for months. While Sheila publicly claimed that the vision led her to the scene, the police were not convinced. Her story was riddled with inconsistencies, gaps, and vague explanations that only deepened the investigators' suspicions. Meanwhile, forensic teams worked carefully on the scene, collecting traces of footprints, fibers, potential DNA, and analyzing injuries on Kelly's body. Although the details were carefully kept secret so as not to compromise the case, one thing became clear from the start. The attack was personal. It wasn't the work of a stranger or an opportunistic criminal. It was someone who knew Kelly, someone who harbored deep-seated anger. Psychological profiling has become a key part of the investigation. Detectives brought in behavior experts to help analyze Sheila's actions, behaviors, and written words. Profiles of people who commit such personal crimes often show an accumulation of intrusive thoughts, perceived injustice, and emotional instability. Sheila's behavior, especially the unusual vision claim, fits the pattern seen when criminals try to interfere with an investigation or create a story that distances them from their own involvement. The investigation reached a turning point when detectives obtained and executed a search warrant for Sheila's home. Inside, they found what would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case: a series of handwritten notes, personal diaries, and, most damningly, a letter that Sheila had written but never sent or shared. The letter, filled with harsh and bitter expressions, expressed strong feelings of betrayal and rage. Sheila described Kelly in resentful, jealous terms, expressing emotions that, oddly enough, reflected the emotional state that was believed to have led to the attack. Some parts of the letter read almost like a confession, not in an explicit sense, but in the way they reveal motives, intentions, and state of mind. Detectives carefully analyzed every word. They consulted forensic linguists, who studied the letter's wording, emotional tone, and main messages. Experts noted that while people often write personal notes to vent themselves, the combination of Sheila's written facial expressions, her unpredictable behavior, and suspicious presence at the crime scene created a triangulated picture of involvement. Faced with mounting evidence, the police summoned Sheila for questioning. Over the course of several long, tense interviews, her behavior changed markedly. She started to get indignant, pleading her innocence, but as the investigators insisted on presenting her with inconsistencies in her testimony, the records they found, and the witness testimony they gathered, Sheila became defensive, then backed down, and finally quietly resigned. Throughout this time, she continued to deny direct involvement in Kelly's death. But for the detectives, the pattern was clear. They built a case based not only on physical evidence, but also on a powerful combination of circumstantial evidence and behavioral analysis. By this point, The media had caught wind of the investigation, and the small coastal town was engulfed in the unfolding drama. Local news stations posted daily updates, reporters camped outside the police station, and neighbors whispered theories about a love triangle that had become deadly. For the public, the question was no longer just who did it, but why. How could something so violent, so deliberate, happen here in their quiet, familiar city? For detectives, the arrest of Sheila Graham Trott was both a milestone and a difficult moment. On the day the police took her into custody, Sheila looked outwardly calm, collected, almost detached. But the weight of the investigation grabbed her. For the investigators who worked tirelessly to solve the case, it was bittersweet. They identified their suspect, but they knew that the scars of the crime extended far beyond the arrest, penetrating deep into the heart of the Brennan family and into the city itself. The investigation eventually revealed a tragic truth. Kelly Brennan, a beloved woman, was the victim of a jealous rage that had been simmering for far too long. Her death was not the result of a chance encounter or an accidental crime, but a deliberate act of a person who allowed anger and resentment to cloud all judgment. As Sheila sat in pre-trial detention awaiting formal charges, detectives were finalizing a mountain of evidence that they would soon present to prosecutors. They knew that the upcoming legal battle would not be easy. Cases built on emotional entanglement and mostly circumstantial evidence are rarely straightforward, but they were confident that they had enough power to ensure justice for Kelly. As the city prepared for the trial, one nagging question hung in the air. Could the courtroom finally deliver the completion and accountability they so desperately needed? When the courtroom doors finally opened in September 2014, the small town of Indialantic, Florida, held its breath. It was more than just another ordeal. It was a moment of reckoning. For nearly 4 years, whispers of jealousy, betrayal, and rage circulated through the streets, echoed through local cafes, and echoed in the quiet pews of the church. Now the people of the city longed for the truth to emerge under oath, for the evidence to be revealed, and for justice to triumph in the clear light of the law. At the center of the storm was Sheila Graham Trott, the ex-wife of former Mayor Dan Trott, now accused of first-degree murder of Kelly Brennan, the beloved nurse who won Dan's heart. On opening day, Sheila walked into the courtroom dressed in a conservative, carefully chosen outfit, flanked by her defense team. Her face was an unreadable mask, her demeanor calm, almost detached. She maintained her innocence for a long time, even as the walls around her seemed to shrink with each new revelation, with each new piece of evidence, both physical and circumstantial. The prosecution's opening statement was carefully drafted, delivered by Assistant State Attorney Tom Hastings, who approached the jury with deliberate precision. Hastings led them through a gripping narrative. The story of a love triangle that escalated into tragedy. The story of Kelly and Dan's blossoming romance, overshadowed by Sheila's festering resentment. He described the increasingly unstable relationship between the two women, the growing tension that filled Kelly's days with anxiety, and finally the fateful night when Kelly was lured to a dark beach and murdered. Hastings presented this act not as a crime of sudden, uncontrollable passion, but as a cold, calculated decision. A deliberate act born of jealousy that had grown into something deadly. Central to the prosecution's version was a bizarre statement Sheila made to her sons, that she had a vision, a psychic moment, a dream, that led her to Kelly's body at Mark's Landing. Investigators, the prosecution explained, found no evidence to support the idea of a psychic episode or divine epiphany. Instead, they argued, Sheila's so-called vision was nothing more than a hastily fabricated legend, a clumsy attempt to explain how she knew the exact location of the crime scene. Expert witnesses, including forensic experts, were called to the podium, who detailed the nature of Kelly's injuries and the characteristics of the blunt object used in the attack. Handwriting experts analyzed Sheila's personal handwriting, focusing on a particularly incriminating letter found during a search of her home. A letter filled with bitterness, jealousy, and emotional turmoil. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was the letter itself. Prosecutors carefully presented excerpts to the jury, always keeping in mind to present them in the proper context. They highlighted Sheila's expressions of rage, her sense of betrayal, and her obsessive preoccupation with Dan's relationship with Kelly. Prosecutors argued that this emotional storm, if left unchecked, escalated into a deliberate act of violence. The defense, for its part, was determined not to surrender the land lightly. Sheila's lawyers portrayed her as a woman devastated by the collapse of her marriage, emotionally wounded but incapable of murder. They highlighted the lack of direct physical evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon clearly linked to Sheila. The defense put forward alternative theories. Could someone else have been responsible? Is it possible that Sheila's unusual vision, as strange as it was genuine? They pointed to gaps in the timeline, questioned the credibility of witnesses' memories after so many years, and urged jurors not to convict on the basis of circumstantial evidence and emotional narratives alone. Throughout the trial, Sheila remained mostly calm. Observers in the courtroom drew attention to her behavior, which became a subject of admiration. Some saw stoicism, others, cold detachment, and still others, the pose of a woman resigned to an inevitable fate. For Kelly Brennan's family, sitting quietly in the gallery, every day that passed was a painful exercise in endurance. They listened to how Kelly's life was dissected, how her last moments were analyzed, how her private world was revealed in a public forum. They testified about character assessments, legal arguments, forensic details, all in pursuit of what they wanted most: accountability. As the trial dragged on for several weeks, public interest only intensified. Local news stations covered the events daily, courtroom sketches made evening broadcasts, and commentators on local radio discussed the power of the accusation. Was there enough evidence to convict? Will the defense be able to sow enough seeds of doubt? Will the jury render a verdict that will lead to the closure of the community? Legal experts weighed in, noting that cases based on emotional turmoil and circumstantial evidence are notoriously difficult to predict. They explained that jurors are asked not only to evaluate the facts, but also to weigh emotional undercurrents, piece together motives, and decide what is reasonable and what is not. In this case, they were faced with a particularly difficult task: to separate the noise of public perception from the essence of the evidence. When the case finally came to the jury, tension hung in the air both inside and outside the courtroom. Families, friends, neighbors, everyone was looking forward to the verdict. Will the jury see Sheila as a misunderstood, grieving woman in tragic circumstances? Or will they see her as a calculating figure who has allowed jealousy and resentment to turn into something dark and deadly? The answer was not long in coming. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. As the word echoed through the courtroom, emotions spilled to the surface. The Kelly family huddled together, tears streaming down their faces, relief and grief intertwined. Sheila, on the other hand, sat motionless, her expression unintelligible, as if the scale of the moment had not yet fully grasped her. The sentencing phase was short and, in a sense, anticlimax. Given the nature of the crime and the jury's decision, the outcome was clear. Sheila was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a hard-fought victory for prosecutors, the culmination of years of thorough investigation, legal strategy, and tireless efforts. For Kelly's loved ones, it was bittersweet. Justice, perhaps, but not consummation. Neither the verdict nor the verdict could bring back the woman they lost. In the years that followed, Sheila continued to seek legal remedies to challenge her sentence. She appealed, arguing that her defense had been inadequate, that the evidence had been misinterpreted, and that the trial had been flawed. But in 2018, an appeals court upheld the sentence, closing the door to legal proceedings and leaving Sheila to serve a life sentence behind bars. The Kelly Brennan case remains one of the most memorable chapters in the history of Indialantic. It is a story of love that has gone bad, of emotions left unchecked, of psychological distress, and of a community forever changed by an act of violence that it could neither predict nor fully understand. But beyond the headlines and the drama in the courtroom, the heart of the story belongs to Kelly herself. Friends and family remember Kelly not for how she died, but for how she lived. With kindness, with generosity, with passion, and with a heart that was wide open to others. Her legacy is preserved not in the sterile language of court transcripts or the dry details of court decisions, but in the lives she touched and in the people who continue to speak her name with love, reverence, and sorrow. As Indialantic slowly moved forward after the tragedy, There was a general understanding that healing would take time, that the wounds left behind would not heal easily. But she also had a determination, a quiet, unwavering determination, to remember Kelly Brennan for who she really was. Not as a victim, not as a headline figure, but as a woman of power, warmth, and light.